Sometimes it can be uncomfortable to be on a QBR and say, your renewal's coming up in 6 months. If your renewal was today, would you be renewing? Or is there something that might change over the next 6 months that would affect your renewal? And I think traditionally, those were not questions we were asking. And therefore, there was like underlying risk that we were, of course, missing. And I think it takes time to get comfortable asking those types of questions. But when it's part of your internal culture, we have a saying, clear is kind. And I think we really do live and breathe that both internally and with our customers.
Hello, and welcome to the CX Files. Today's guest is Lilli Gordon. Lilli is the Global Director of Customer Experience for Scaled Commercial at Culture Amp. Over the past 2 years, she grew retention 15% through scalable programs without increasing CSM headcount. She worked across functions to increase NRR 10%, and after proving success, she took on an 800 additional accounts. Her career in customer success started in the SF Bay Area with roles at Presence Learning and Nextdoor. Lilli, thanks for joining.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
I want to ask you about an experience or a time that you went through at Culture Amp where you had to sort of rethink in order to take the next step. Was there like a specific story you could tell us about, a challenge or a difficult time and sort of how you recalibrated for that?
Yeah, such a good question. And customer success has evolved so much over the past few years, so very pertinent as well. I would say about 4-ish years ago now, I was really one of the only CSMs working with our scaled segment at the time. And it was quickly becoming something that wasn't manageable the way that it was designed at that time for me to be the only one handling all of the touch points that we were doing, all of the check-in type things we were doing with our customers. And so we really decided to take that time to say, how do we make this more scalable? How are we going to keep servicing all of these customers without necessarily hiring more? And that was really the first time we kind of took a look at what does this customer journey look like, really digging into data of which touch points are actually providing value and which actions that customers take are actually leading to retention. And so after diving into a lot of that data, we designed certain programs, certain playbooks, certain types of email outreach that could be automated that took a lot off the CSM's plate so that the CSM could really focus on those important touch points, the ones that are driving value, the ones that are much more strategic. And that way we're using the best, value from our CSMs and using the best of their time. I think something that we learned from that is that it can be easy to overshoot that a bit. I think we might have swung the pendulum too far right out of the gate, right? So we might have automated too many emails, pulled back on too many touch points. And so I think that's an important learning is finding that balance, and it's okay to experiment and to fail. That's the only way that you'll be able to learn what works and doesn't. But it's important to keep a pulse on which of these email programs are performing well, which ones aren't, which touch points are still getting the impact you want without human intervention, and which ones still require that human touch point. So it's a constant pendulum that's always swinging back and forth. I think we're in a much better middle point now, but it's a constant tweaking process.
Yeah, I think that it's absolutely a balance, and it's going to vary by organization, by customer segment, by the types of products and services the business is selling. I wanted to ask you about, you know, this initiative to scale and the constraints that were outlined. Can you kind of take us into that discussion and like how was this sort of the courage to take on this challenge? How was that born and what were the sort of thoughts inside of the team that led to this conclusion?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think it comes from a a couple different places. I think obviously for the business, right, they want to be able to bring as much value to their customers as they can, but also provide the right type of value. Like more touch points doesn't necessarily mean more value to a customer. And
Right.
throwing more CSMs or more headcount at a customer base also doesn't necessarily solve the problems that CS is actually looking to solve. So when you
Mm,
take that step back and you're really looking at what value can our customers get? What does that journey actually look like? I think then you can really start to dive into what is most important? What are we just doing because maybe it's the way CS has been doing things for a long time? I think we were, kind of stuck in that place where it's like you send a check-in email, every week or whatever that might be.
mhm.
And like we don't necessarily like need to be doing that. I also think taking the time to really pull that data of like what are the actions a customer takes that does lead to retention, or what are the getting customer feedback on like what are the most valuable touch points you've had with a CSM over the past year. Taking the time to really dive into that will give you more confidence in deciding where you can pull back and where you need to keep that pushing forward.
Oh, that's a great insight. I think there's a lot of organizations out there today that are in some stage of, scalable programs deployment, right? And implementation. And then, you know, a lot of it is AI tools, but it's also process and it's also culture, right? And, depending on the organization's culture, they might be more hesitant or more willing to swing that pendulum, right? But hopefully your story can inspire people with some examples to take the step forward and get the results. Next question here, when you started in your career, the landscape of tools that were available was very different. Even in the last few years, the landscape is evolving very quickly. But, in the beginning, it was kind of bare bones, and there's a lot of stuff that, requires like a lot of customization. And I wonder, like, was there some early kind of friction with the tools or early experiences that sort of shaped your philosophy on like how to scale CX?
Yes, great question. Yeah, I think when we first started, I want to say we were maybe using HubSpot or some other like tool that was more built for marketing, I would say, than really like a CS built tool or, any sort of automation that has CS in mind, right? Those tools didn't really exist at the time. So we kind of tried to use either, something sales like an SDR might use because it had automated emailing, or something marketing might use, but ultimately those tools aren't going to be the best for what CS needs to do.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, there were times where, we had to get creative or we weren't able to trigger a playbook messaging by the data points that we wanted to because that type of thing just wasn't available at the time. So there were times where, we did need to get creative. And I think also it was nice because as we were evolving our programming, the tools did start to kind of evolve with us, which allowed us to then experiment further. And you can still see like at the basis what's working and what's not in terms of just your very initial kind of like email program, and then that will help you guide, what tools do you then want to experiment with moving forward and what's going to make the most sense based on what's working and what's not. So I think it's okay to, start small. It's okay to, just start with, one automated email sequence and see how it lands, and then you'll learn something and then you can go from there. Obviously, a big topic now is AI, and I think that's definitely been something that's been extremely helpful. But ultimately, AI helps like create capacity, but it's not a headcount replacement. It'll
Mm,
free your CSMs up to do work that really requires human judgment, like those really strategic conversations, which is what we hire them for anyway. That's what I want them to be focusing on. That change management, aligning with executives. So the AI isn't replacing the CSMs or isn't replacing those important conversations. It's just standardizing that foundational work so that the humans can really focus on influence and strategy.
yeah, yeah. I have this evolving hypothesis or just thought about, where are the new opportunities that AI unlocks? I think that the narrative around AI especially in CX, customer success, customer support, is it's like this, this headcount replacement. And I agree with you that it's not the right way to think about it. It's really a growth opportunity. It's not, I mean, you could save costs with it, but it's really the bigger thing is the growth opportunity and using it to empower the team to do better work, more impactful work, right? And that's just a general opinion, I guess, but I think that trend is turning more and more, and people are realizing that AI is, yeah, I mean, it's replacing some jobs outright, but a lot more jobs are being amplified by it. So anyway, I wanted to ask you about you manage the scaled commercial segment, and my understanding is that this is a sort of a middle ground between high touch enterprise and low touch SMB. So, at Culture Amp, I was doing a little bit of research, and there's this idea of like people science and sort of the organizational psychology. But how do you sort of leverage that and bring these things together to do high value, consultative experiences for, at scale?
Yes, such a good question, and something I am so grateful that we have at Culture Amp, both internally and for our customers as well. So while some of our lower touch customers might not be speaking with a people scientist directly, it's something that we get to embed in our product and also embed in some of like our standardized messaging, or get that our CSMs get to be trained on. But one of the most impactful things that they've helped me with was design programming around matching a customer's objective to how they should be adopting and using the product to get the most value out of it. So if we're able to collect that information from a customer, right, hopefully in the sales cycle of like, what are you really looking to get out of Culture Amp? Because we have these products, but every customer might be using it slightly differently based on what their overarching objective is. And so the people science team is able to help me create, okay, so if your objective is retention, if your objective is designing a better learning and development program for your company, what are the specific tools that you should use in Culture Amp? Where should you start? How do you build on that? And so that way we're able to create this really amazing guided program for them, and then have CS come in where it's necessary, but the people science is already built into it. So we're so lucky to have that, is really embedded in part of Culture Amp.
Yeah, I think, culture is this thing that is all around us, in the world that we live in our daily lives, and of course at work. And making it explicit and making it part of the operation and making it part of the conversation, I think is so powerful because it shapes everything. And the employee experience affects the customer experience. Of course, there's an interaction between these forces. But yeah, I think the example of Culture Amp is an interesting one because that is the nature of the product, right? It's talking about
Yes.
this culture piece. Yeah. So I want to dig in a little bit more on, this tension between, the AI automation and the human element in the customer relationship. Could you like share a specific scenario or story where AI tools allowed your team to be more human, maybe by picking up on some signal that would otherwise have been lost?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think when we think about AI and where we want it to help too, right, it comes back to segmentation as well, and also thinking about what is tactical and what is strategic. So those are the two things that
Hmm.
I think about when I think about where do I want AI to support our journey. So, of course, not all customers need the same CS motion. Over servicing a low impact account will burn the team out. So that's a great place where AI can come in. But we
Hmm.
also don't want to underservice those high impact accounts. So where
Right.
is that balance? And treating each customer slightly differently. And that's where that really diving into segmentation can be helpful. But I think I like to sometimes think about it as like a first line of defense almost, in terms of a customer question coming in. So say a customer comes in and says, how do I use, your performance tool? That's a very generalized question. There could be a tactical piece to that. There could be a very strategic piece to that. So can we have the AI come in and say, okay, are you trying to learn how to, launch a cycle, or are you really trying to understand like what's the best strategy for launching a new type of performance review process, right? And that way we have really clear lines of, is this a question that should be handled by AI and maybe eventually a support person, or is this a very strategic question that is worth getting the CSM involved and getting their time. So I think that's the really a really helpful part is like getting that question in and saying like where does that type of question go. And I don't want necessarily my CSM spending time saying, click here, click there. Again, that's really like the old ways of doing things, spending an hour long call of, kind of just tactical clicking through things. That's something that AI can now help with. And so my team can really focus on, okay, once you've understand where to click, how to set up a cycle, let's really dive into the people science, the strategy. What is the outcome you're looking to drive from this cycle? What is going
Hmm.
to make you look really good? What is your business looking to achieve from this? And that way, we're really connecting CS time to driving customer value, which of course then drives retention. So just really freeing up that time to do what matters most.
Yeah, I mean that's a great answer. I think the overall opportunity for people out there is to move your team up the value chain, right?
Yeah.
Every hour spent, can be higher value. Yeah, that's great stuff. I wanted to ask you about a specific detail that came up in my research about Culture Amp. Is there's this idea of the check-in, which is it's used internally to sort of make people feel psychological safety for continuous feedback. And how does that internal culture translate to your external strategy, especially if you're like, for example, you're coaching a customer through a high stakes renewal or they're at risk to churn or something like that?
Yeah, great question. Yes, so yeah, check-ins internally, like one-on-ones, sometimes they're more formally called, I guess, are a very important part of our culture. We have like a really great part of our platform is the one-on-one tool, like kind of sets it up so that it's a really safe place to ask maybe questions that maybe for some people wouldn't feel as comfortable. So my team can like note on their little sliders that maybe their well-being is a little bit lower this week. Maybe they're struggling with something outside of work that I, need to know about so that I can best support them. And it wouldn't
Hmm.
necessarily be something that would come up in conversation unless it was kind of forefront and center. And it's such an amazing way to for me to make connections with my direct reports and be the best manager that I can be to them. And I think that translates to how we work with our customers as well in a slightly different way. But I think it's like asking sometimes the hard questions or asking the question behind the question. We work a lot on that in terms of, okay, the customer maybe is saying this, but is there something behind what they're asking that they're not being as upfront about? Or, being very upfront, sometimes it can be uncomfortable to be on a QBR and say, your renewal is coming up in 6 months. If your renewal was today, would you be renewing? Or is there something that might change over the next 6 months that would affect your renewal? And I think traditionally, those were not questions we were asking, and therefore there was like underlying risk that we were of course missing. And I think it takes time to get comfortable asking those types of questions, but when it's part of your internal culture, we have a saying, clear is kind. And I think we really do live and breathe that both internally and with our customers. And making sure my team feels supported, like you're not in trouble if your customer says, you know what, I'm not happy and I'm wanting to leave. We would way rather know that with 6 months in advance to say, maybe you've made up your mind, but are there anything we could do to try and, make you see value help you see value over the next 6 months versus all of a sudden they come up for renewal and it's a completely surprise churn. So making
Right.
sure, my team feels fully supported and that, this is not something where it's like you're going to get in trouble for, getting the answers to these questions. It's actually going to be celebrated.
Yeah, I mean, clear is kind. I mean, what a powerful turn of phrase. I think that's just such a great way to sum it up. And yeah, I can already, just talking to you today, I can feel that there's an openness in the culture there that I'm getting, a directness. but with the psychological safety element as well. It's not like brutal directness. It's like caring directness, right? That's great. Yeah, I mean, I guess Culture Amp is kind of going to be naturally is going to be very focused on building a nice company culture, but hopefully other organizations can learn from this as well. So, we've talked sort of a little bit about the past. We've talked a little bit about the present. I'd like to switch and talk a little bit about the future here. Now, there's a massive trend of, the customer experience becoming more of an overarching function, of an overarching understanding that customer experience is this one thing that crosses employee experience, the end user experience, as well as sort of across departments in the business. Do you think that there's going to be more and more like customer experience departments as a dedicated function? What do you see as the sort of organizational changes and maybe the roles of the future?
Yeah. Yeah, also a great question. And I think yes, I think CS has evolved from being just like, oh, are you, checking in on your customers to really being like a strategic heartbeat of the company. One of the biggest shifts for me as a leader was realizing, CS success depends less on customer conversations and more on that internal alignment. So,
Mm,
product partnership, sales expectations, the customer journey starts from the first time they see your marketing, renewal ownership clarity, clarity of the complete customer journey. And so I think that we'll continue to see that shift of that customer success isn't this small bubble within a company, but it's really something that everyone in the company should be thinking about. And having that alignment within your company, within your leaders is so important. And so we definitely have time where all of our leaders from sales, CS, product, marketing will all be together in a room focusing on one cohesive strategy versus having each department maybe have their own separate strategy because at the end of the day, the product should be delivering customer value. Sales wants to deliver customer value. So it's not just CS that's working on that. And ultimately, everyone in the business wants to see GRR and NRR improve, right? Those are like bottom line metrics of a company. And just because you're not in CS, it doesn't mean that you don't directly impact those metrics. So I think having everyone involved in that is so important and will continue to evolve hopefully as well as more companies see the importance of it.
absolutely. Yeah. I think, the organization of the future has to be much more responsive to customers' actual experiences with the business, and sort of narrowing the gap or closing the gap, tightening the feedback loop there between
Mhm.
customer experiences something, business learns from it, business improves, right, and then the cycle turns around. But that sort of the speed of that feedback loop, the agility of the business, that's obviously going to be a competitive advantage. And I think the
Absolutely.
organizations that sort of get that right and get it early are just going to, accelerate. So one thing here is, with the future of the tooling and the sort of the sort of the digital desk, the desktop, the experience that we have on our computers day to day doing our jobs. There's every organization today has some stack of tools that they're using, and those are where a lot of the work gets done. Whether it's a video call or a knowledge tool or self-service tool or ticket management, all these kinds of things. And all of these tools are collecting data, right? And there's all this data flowing in. How do you think about like the future of like predictive analytics, sort of intelligent metrics, and how does that affect, the sort of the positions inside of the team as well, right? Where, are you moving more into this direction of sort of data storytelling, data curation? How do you think about the data picture?
Yeah. I mean, I think data is really the core of any scaled program, right? Because you need those types of data points to make informed decisions. You need good data points to trigger automation. And so having really rich data is super important for any type of scaled CS program. And at the same time, looking at those metrics can help guide you and make decisions. Like I dig really deep into churn retros. Like, yes, are there tools that could, do that completely for me, yes, but I really like to get in there and really dig into like why are our customers leaving and what are those little adjustments I can then go make on my pendulum to bring us back to that example to kind of just continue to tweak things in that way. So I think having that rich data is so crucial to this type of program and to making any updates that you can, and helps your customers as well because then they are getting what they need at the right time in their journey, not just when we think they might need it, and getting what they need faster, getting to see value faster. So ultimately it's beneficial for everyone to be really focused on that data. We're working on a churn predictive analysis model right now. And again, I don't think that's going to necessarily completely change how a CSM would function, besides the fact that, okay, now we can get to mitigating risk even earlier, which is ultimately the goal of any CSM and any CS practice is where is risk? How do we spot it better? And how do we mitigate it more quickly earlier and get us a better chance of resolving that, getting back to seeing value? So I'm actually really excited to see where that, churn predictive analysis will come and how that can just make my team even more effective earlier on in the journey.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's clearly it sounds sort of like a holy grail, kind of project where you can just say, oh, early signs, the warning lights start flashing, well in advance, right? Yeah, I love that.
At
I
the
wanted
same
to,
time, right, that
yeah,
won't solve everything, especially at scale, because,
right.
we'll have well, we might say like, oh, if a customer doesn't do X, Y, and Z action, that's a risk signal. But then there might be customers who that's not something that they want to do with the product, right? So it doesn't
Hmm.
solve everything. There's still like some
Right.
customers who are just going to use things differently. But ultimately, at scale, we do want to look at the biggest picture, and then those outliers we can handle in a slightly different way. So it definitely isn't completely the solve to everything, but it also is really exciting when we are focusing at scale.
Definitely. Yeah, I wanted to touch on one more point here, which is about I'm using a term like data packaging, like packaging up the insights, packaging up what you've learned for handoff to other teams and other departments. And so sort of, we talked before about, the customer experience being the sort of the center of the business, sort of informing all the functions. Do you have a thought about, how does that handoff work? What does that sort of document or what does that output look like? And sort of how do you think about this idea of like distributing the insights to the different departments?
Yeah, great question. So I think, yeah, data that we get from our customers, I don't think like CSM should be the gatekeeper, right? Or I should be the gatekeeper by any means. I think that the leaders of other parts of the business should have access to that data as much as I do. So NPS, for example, like, yes, is that a helpful metric for me? Absolutely. But if we're getting product feedback in those NPS responses, why shouldn't the product leaders be able to see that directly without me necessarily like waiting a month later, gathering all that data and then presenting it to them? Similarly for sales, like we're getting a customer complaining about how the expectations were maybe set up. A sales leader should be able to see that right away without, me necessarily waiting to gather more examples to share with them. So I think everyone having access to what our customers are saying, asking for, and needing right away is extremely helpful. Of course, we have ways to submit product feedback and then have product gather that right away. So I think it's all about just getting them that information easily, quickly, not necessarily like waiting for a quarter later, waiting 6 months later, because then it might already be, we've moved on to a new problem and now we're not focusing on the right thing. So being able to just democratize all of that customer data and that customer feedback, because ultimately it should be guiding how everyone in the company is choosing to prioritize.
Absolutely. One final question to cap off the episode today. If you can think back to, Lilli from a year ago or 2 years ago, what is one piece of advice that you would give her?
Yeah. I really think it goes back to not being afraid to fail. I think experimenting is such a powerful part of scaling. And when I talk to other scaled leaders at other organizations, like no one has this completely figured out, and it's also completely evolving all of the time. And I think that's the fun part about this type of job is, maybe with an enterprise customer, we wouldn't be able to experiment as much, but with a larger group and a slightly lower stakes, we get to just try different things and see what lands and what doesn't. And so just not being afraid to fail, trying new things, getting really creative, being able to experiment and having fun with that. And that just knowing that no matter what, you're gonna learn something really helpful, and then it's gonna help you make those leaps forward.
A great note to end on. Everybody, this has been Lilli Gordon. She's on LinkedIn if you want to reach out and connect with her, ask her questions. And that's it for today's episode of the CX Files. We will see you next time.